When Ronald Reagan ran against President Jimmy Carter in the presidential election of 1980, one of the huge national security issues that hung over that election like a rain cloud was the more than 60 Americans who'd been held as hostages by Iran since November the previous year. Iran had its fundamentalist revolution in 1979. In November 1979, radicals stormed the U.S. Embassy and took all those Americans hostage. And then the following year, nearly a year into that ordeal, while the U.S. presidential election was coming to its end, Iran's view of the world and of its most pressing problems in the world changed pretty dramatically, because Iran got invaded. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded their much larger neighbor to the east. Iraq launched a full-scale conventional warfare invasion of Iran, and thus started the unbelievably bloody Iran-Iraq war, which would go on for 8 solid years without a break, and that would kill more than 1 million people, including lots and lots and lots of kids. So that started. The terrible Iran-Iraq war started. It started 5 weeks before the U.S. presidential election in 1980. And even though Iran, by that point, had been holding all these Americans hostage for more than a year, Iran decided that they would do a deal to let the American hostages out. And one of the reasons why is that they knew the deal would involve a lot of money. One of the things they would be trading the hostages for was the freeing up of Iranian assets, and they desperately needed that because of the giant conventional land war they had just entered into with one of their neighboring countries. They needed the money. And so, as President Carter campaigned for his re-election in the 1980 campaign, Carter administration officials were hard at work in negotiation with the Iranians to get the American hostages out. And the Iranians, by all accounts, really hated President Jimmy Carter. I mean, they hated America generally, but they particularly hated President Carter. And they negotiated a deal to free the hostages that would go into effect the day that President Carter left office. And so Ronald Reagan had his inauguration day. At 8:31 that morning, the outgoing President Jimmy Carter advised the incoming President, Ronald Reagan, oh, by the way, the hostages are getting out today. And then Ronald Reagan was sworn in, and in Tehran, the planes carrying the hostages took off. And at 2 in the afternoon that day, the newly sworn-in President Ronald Reagan was able to make the announcement that at long last, after 14 months, those hostages were coming home. And then the first thing that he did as a former president, Jimmy Carter, who negotiated the release of the prisoners and who got it done as his last act as president, the first thing he did as a former president is that he flew to Germany to greet the freed Americans. And the crowd held signs that said, "Thanks, Jimmy." He did it. It took him to the very last moments of his presidency, but he got them out.
It is worth emphasizing that Iran released our hostages in 1981, the day Ronald Reagan was sworn into office.
Which is true. But he didn't do it. Ronald Reagan didn't do it by waving a magic wand as soon as he got inaugurated. Jimmy Carter did it. It's funny, though. This year's Republican presidential candidates, they like to bring up Ronald Reagan whenever Iran comes up in any conversation. Rand Paul did it at that same debate where you just saw Ted Cruz speaking. Chris Christie randomly brought up Ronald Reagan in his first campaign ad about Iran. This weekend, Marco Rubio raised the specter of President Reagan while he lambasted the Obama administration for getting 4 Americans freed this weekend from Iranian prisons.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true. But the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
After Jimmy Carter got the 1979-1980 era American hostages freed from Iran, President Reagan, during his presidency, had to deal with a new slew of American hostages taken by groups supported by Iran, particularly in Lebanon. And not only did President Reagan negotiate with Iran to try to get those Americans freed, he negotiated a deal that involved illegally shipping Iran a bunch of weapons in secret. And did I mention it was illegal? And it didn't work. And it was the biggest scandal of his presidency and one of the larger and more salacious presidential scandals of all time, particularly since it resulted at one point in the criminal indictment of most of the president's serving national security staff. But that, Ronald Reagan, that is who Today's Republican presidential candidates like to cite as a role model for handling Iran. They like to cite the president who made an Iran deal so bad that he secretly sold Iran weapons and he still didn't get the hostages out. The great and big-hearted E.J. Dionne at the Washington Post has an excellent new book out called Why the Right Went Wrong: Conservatism from Goldwater to the Tea Party and Beyond. And it is a great book. And the central thesis of the book is that, I'm quoting E.J. here, the history of contemporary American conservatism is a story of disappointment and betrayal. And the opening chapters of the book are about Ronald Reagan, and among other things, this fascinating and weird development in our time in which Ronald Reagan is basically deliberately misremembered on the right. How Ronald Reagan's real record has been submarined, and all of his faults and compromises have been ascribed to other people and not to him. So conservatives can have one hero in modern history about whom they don't feel terrible disappointment and betrayal. They basically reinvented Reagan as perfect, even on Iran of all things, because they need something to believe in, even if it's fake. But because he's E.J. Dionne, he says it much more nicely than that and with way more footnotes. Joining us now is the great and big-hearted Washington Post columnist, E.J. Dionne. E.J., it's great to see you. Congratulations on this.
Thank you so much.
Obviously, the whole book is not about Reagan, but this element of Reagan being remembered as perfect because modern conservatives need a hero is a very evocative thesis to me.
Well, I think it's absolutely true, and right at the beginning of the book, I quote a conservative, Charles Krauthammer, who says you can choose your Reagan.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the ways in which conservatives can hold Ronald Reagan up is different kinds of conservatives remember different Reagans. A lot of the Tea Party conservatives remember the movement Reagan. At the beginning, I quote Chris McDaniel, that right-wing candidate down in Mississippi, who remembers this really hardline Reagan. And then I quote Governor Haley Barbour, who remembers Ronald Reagan is a very flexible guy. Purity is the enemy of victory, says Haley Barbour. But if you actually go back at that time, there were a lot of conservatives who were very critical of Reagan, among other things, for being too dovish. He committed those troops to Lebanon. I was there at the time. It was a terrible mistake. But then he pulled them out. Mm-hmm. And he
said he wouldn't pull them out, and then he pulled them out. Yes, yeah.
Which was the right thing to do, only it was too late. There were conservatives who criticized him for not sending troops down to Central America. But I think one of the things that saved Reagan is the presidency of George H.W. Bush. In a way, George H.W. Bush died for Ronald Reagan's sins, because when Reagan raised taxes 7 or 8 times, that didn't matter. But when Bush raised taxes, that became a great sin. And so
he became sort of a heat shield in that sense. Anything that Reagan had done that conservatives didn't like they decided it was a Poppy Bush problem.
Exactly. And I think the broader problem is I appreciate you're doing the opening sentence, because I think this sense of betrayal on the part of conservatives, even if they hold Reagan off, reflects the fact that ever since Goldwater's time, and I take it all the way back to Goldwater, conservative politicians have had to make a series of promises to the conservative base that they couldn't possibly keep. They promised a much smaller government, but the country doesn't really want it. Even Tea Partiers who are on Social Security and Medicare don't want a smaller government. They promised to roll back cultural change. But guess what? Most of the country actually supports the cultural changes since the 1960s. Most of the country supports equality between men and women. Now, most of the country supports gay marriage. So you have all these conservatives out there who feel we elect our guys, and then they don't get done the things that they said they get done. And I think that gives us this campaign where Donald Trump and Ted Cruz are the 2 leading candidates in the primaries.
Also,
right now.
I mean, it's not incidental that the Goldwater who sets this tone is the Goldwater who lost and never had to govern by the principles that he was articulating. And the Goldwater who ended up repenting later in life on some of his hardest line positions is one who would have not been welcome in the party today.
Right, and Ronald Reagan did a lot of things that would not be welcomed in the party today as well. And when you look at, I also had a lot of fun in the book talking about Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon is such an ambiguous figure. In some ways, he was one of the most liberal presidents we have had. If you look at the creation of EPA, the creation of the Occupational Safety Administration, but he was also one of the hardest line presidents on race, on law and order. And if you go back to that history, his staff reflected this double mind of Richard Nixon. And again, he really contributed to this cycle of disappointment on the right.
E.J. Dionne, the book is Why the Right Went Wrong, Conservatism from Goldwater to the Tea Party and Beyond. Everybody keeps talking about Donald Trump and, to a lesser extent, Ted Cruz like they're a big surprise. This is the explanation of why it's not a surprise. Congratulations,
Thank
E.J.
you so much.
Thank you.